Hello, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. Hi, everybody online, including my parents in Brazil that are watching and our team all across the globe. And so I am Bia. I want to celebrate this land that we stand on, Ohlone territory. I want to thank my wife that I met in Psychedelic Science 2010, and we're 13 years together, and we're psychedelic aficionados couple, and she's been there with me through all my journey of coming out, many years dating, 7 years secretly, and so now I kind of every time I have to drop in there that we're together because it came out in the conference that we organized. So this in many ways is like a peak moment for me. I don't want to get emotional. I cry very easy, so don't get impressed if I do. Um, and I see Jody here too. I met Jody in 2007 when I was like backpacking in the United States, and she took me to her place in Malibu to wake up 5 a.m. to go do some street protesting. And I was like, oh my God, what is this country? Who's this person? What is happening? And so she's here. Rick, in many ways, is like a kind of godfather to my whole, moving to the United States, because he has always been highly supportive. And basically, he likes to give me challenges and he tells, do that. And then I go and I do it. And I'm like, what's next? And, this dynamic of playful like challenges, and we kind of do playful ritual confrontations has helped me grow a lot. And Chacruna has been fiscally sponsored by MAPS originally. And so this is like feeling like an adult. We got our 501c3 status in 2019 after being fiscally sponsored by MAPS a few years. And this is our first in-person fundraising event. And, it's in many ways a peak of something that started 3 years ago when I was backpacking in Mexico and tried peyote and LSD and thought I understood everything about everything. I get it. I understand now. Why am I here? What am I doing in this planet? What is the invisible world? What is the ancestors? Where do I come from? What is beyond? What is time? What is space? What is the self? Why do we belong? What is nature? How am I part of nature? And sacred plants have always made me feel more of a part of nature and of the world. And also just my interest has always been the plants and where they come from and who brought them to us, and this incredible, resilient, beautiful indigenous cultures that have created this knowledge and resist colonization, resist invasion of lands and rape and children kidnapped and being forced to speak other languages and having their territory teared apart, and kept a lot of these plants kept groups together and strengthened their identity, their recognition, their ability to make alliances between different indigenous groups, and transmission of knowledge, socialization, celebration, arts, culture, the reasons why we are here. There's a lot of indigenous myths that tell the story on how man became to be mankind, and they are intricate related to this history of the plants. So they are central to these civilizations. They have helped create this idea on why we're here and where we're going and are part of this culture. So Chacruna is really about bringing to the forefront indigenous knowledge and celebrating the people that found the substances, that got a lot of discovered how to combine plants or which plant is used for what, and we observe their traditions and their cultures, and created our own versions of that. So we are incredibly indebted to these traditions, and we're about supporting them, doing indigenous reciprocity, protection of sacred plants and cultural traditions, not dissociating the plants from where they come from. So that's a whole area for us, indigenous reciprocity, shamanism, plant medicine. And the other area is what we call psychedelic justice, which is basically elevating the voices of minorities in this field. So bringing the discussions on race and gender into the forefront and supporting the voices of women, of people of color, of indigenous people, of queer people, of disabled people, of immigrants, of veterans, of people from the global south, people like myself that have an accent, and I'm proud of my accent, and bringing this voices to the forefront and helping rewrite the narrative that the psychedelic field tell itself. The psychedelic renaissance or the psychedelic science, the psychedelic field did not start in the 60s with a bunch of white men with white jackets making research in laboratories. It's not where it comes from. It's much older, and these voices have been invisible and marginalized, and we try to bring them to the forefront and elevate these voices and help change the whole tone of the field, talk about queer issues, talk about racial justice, talk about reciprocity, talk about the different difficult conversations on commodification of psychedelics, on the banalization of sacred knowledge, the reductionism that science can make. And so we are on the cultural trenches in the forefront, trying to also say that ideas matter and awareness matter and knowledge matter. It's not just, about what can you see, but the whole zeitgeist of this movement. Chacruna is there standing to keep it honest, to keep it accountable, and to have integrity and ethics. And yeah, thank you so much, everybody.
Awesome. Oh. Thank you so much, Bia, for all that. That was just so many amazing words. Hope everyone enjoyed that. That's going to continue right now as we're going to bring not only her back up, but as well as Rick. We are going to start the Q&A portion. So we're for both online and in person. There's going to be a variety of different questions coming through. So just everyone, if there is a technical delay, fingers crossed there's not, just bear with us. But yeah, let's just get some ideas sparked. And remember, this is no limits. We want all ideas coming together and ready and out in the open. So without further ado, let's bring these excellent duo back up here, Bia and Rick.
Oh, do you want over here?
Okay. Richard Doblin. First, thank you so much for who you are, for everything you do for this movement, and for what you've done for me and for Chacruna. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say that my introduction to psychedelics began both with LSD and also with synthetic mescaline. So when I was in college, this person came by and had half a pound of mescaline. And so I bought it all. And friends and I then capped it up, and for the next school year, after which I dropped out of school. But I did a lot of mescaline, a lot of LSD. But I was more oriented towards the clinical research, towards the Western science. And so what I really appreciate about Bia and about Chacruna is that sort of balances out this idea of the plants and the indigenous cultures and where these things originated. I do want to say that I've had a lot of fun over the years with Bia. She's got a really great instinct for what is the next controversial topic that needs to be discussed. And she would have these conferences with the different controversial topics. So I really appreciated it that Bia goes to where the flame is in a way, doesn't, flutter around it, but she goes right to the heart of things. We've also had a sort of a personal contest, I think, to see who's the most stubborn. Yes, it's great that she thinks that I'm the most stubborn, which I think maybe I am actually. But over the years, it's been just a real pleasure to get to know Bia and to learn more from her and through her about indigenous contexts and uses. But I do think it's important to say that the sort of origins of psychedelics did not just begin in the jungles of South America or in the mountains of Mexico with mushrooms. That it also began in Greece with the Eleusinian Mysteries from 1600 BC to around 392 when it was wiped out by the Catholic Church. So that we have these roots that are throughout humanity that go back to the origins of culture, in a way, the origins of democracy. And, with the Greeks began with cultures that were heavily infused by the psychedelic visions. So it's really all of our global patrimony and I don't know the proper other female word for that. But that it's something that we all need to find ways in our own cultural context to bring forth. But not only do we need to respect where it comes from and to have this idea of reciprocity, but I think the other part is that I come from this Reformed Jewish tradition, and the idea that we're taught is that it's our obligation to take the rituals of the past and rethink them and revise them for the present circumstances. So people might say, oh, that's the opposite of respect for where things came from. But actually, we think it's the height of respect to actually take something that had a cultural context, that had a meaning, but now the contexts have shifted, and now we need to move that in other ways. So I would say, since nothing is off the table here, I would say that we think about some of the ayahuasca churches, but they tend to be patriarchal, homophobic, authoritarian. So we have to recreate, I think, in our own context, how we support these experiences, and then how we support people both in the preparation and the integration. So I think the conversations that Bia has generated through the different conferences that she's organized and through this meeting today, there's a really critical point that and a critical role that Chacruna plays in this widening psychedelic renaissance. So it's not just all about us working with FDA and working in scientific context. It's really about bringing all of this forward. And so it's just a pleasure to be here with Bia, and I look forward to our discussion and to questions. And I just want to give a lot of respect for Bia to be an immigrant, to struggle to get her own driver's license, her own green card, all of these things, and to try to bring herself as well to this culture that we share now.
Thank you, Rick. Yeah, for sure. As I said, I met Clancy in 2010 in Psychedelic Science 2010 in San Jose. And for me, it has been a kind of the American dream story that I got to know this world, and through my passion, through ayahuasca and peyote and mushrooms and plant medicine, shamanism, ritual religion, just studying and advocating for the things I believed in, created this organization, and got to be here today. So I'm another story that follow your dreams, and even if it's like an unconventional sort of career, it has a lot of room and a lot of opportunity. And I agree, the whole psychedelic renaissance is pretty dominated by the biomedical model, and the idea of advancing scientific research is important and does help create more awareness. But it's not all about just the medical model. A lot of people feel connected to plant medicines and to ceremony and to ritual, to religion, to plant medicines, to spirits, and to drawn to these cultures that have created these traditions. And I see them as kind of complementary and almost. I'm curious to know, what is since you are like the flag and the person that has helped drive the ship to the medical model, and we're so close to having MDMA recognized, what is your personal relation to ceremony?
I feel I'm very much allergic to ceremony a lot of ways. I grew up, I would say, very much taught by my family and my surroundings about the Holocaust. And, Hitler was a master of ceremony. And mobilizing people's passions in a way to overwhelm their rationality and then to form group identities to the point where their whole societies could be bombed out and people could be massively killed. They could kill others, and they still were supporters of Hitler. So if you look at the number of people that supported Hitler at the end of World War II, it's a lot. So I just had this sense of groups and groupthink that made me frightened. So I didn't really even like football games or things like that. Just the way that groups kind of work together with mobilize their passion. So ceremony for me was difficult. I'm much more of an individual therapy focused rather than group context. I also, had this early experience when I was, 13, and I had my bar mitzvah. I'm the oldest of four, and nothing changed. I was the same the morning after than the morning before. So I had this early sense that these rituals, these ceremonies, may have had potency in the past for a lot of people, but didn't for me and a lot of my generation and friends. So I look at ceremony with a certain kind of suspicion in a way, and I'll just elaborate once that I was back when the União de Vegetal, so the first ayahuasca church that actually then went through the Supreme Court and established the religious freedom for the use of ayahuasca in their contexts. Back before they won the Supreme Court case, I went to a ceremony with Jeffrey Brofman, who ran this chapter of the UDV in the US, and I had a wonderful experience the first time. And I wanted to go back, and they said, sure, you can come back again, but this time you have to decide whether you want to become a member of this community, of this church. And I said, okay, I'd be interested. And they brought up someone who shared the history and the story of UDV. And part of this story was that King Solomon somehow or other found his way from Palestine to the Amazon. And he was the ones that told them to put the two plants together. And I said, okay, that makes sense. It's a metaphor, right? Somebody wise, figures this out. And they're like, no, it's not somebody wise. It's King Solomon. He actually did it. It's not in the history books, but somehow he made it, and back and forth. And I was like, okay, I don't really understand how you could believe that. But I understood that I had to believe that, or at least say I believe that, to be part of this ceremonial culture. And so I was unable to say that. So anyway, ceremony for me has evolved more in the sense of like all-night dance parties where people are doing psychedelics. So that's the kind of where you can move in and out of the party whenever you want. You have your individuality, you have your communality if you want that. So it was sort of the Grateful Dead acid trip Western view of ceremony that I really gravitated to more than these more indigenous cultural contexts. I did, well, on this theme a little bit. A friend of mine was married in a Native American church ceremony. He was an American researcher, and my wife and I went there. And there was this one point, it was all with Navajo. One of the most remarkable things was this Navajo man brought his 9-year-old son to be in the peyote ceremony with us. And this 9-year-old took a bunch of peyote. It was really impressive. But there was this moment where I just, when I know I'm tripping is when I feel that I'm lost. So I have to like get lost before I really feel like the journey begins. So I was like at this place where I'd eaten enough peyote and I was getting lost, and I wanted to just lie down and just sort of close my eyes and kind of let it go. And that was not appropriate because the ceremony, you're supposed to stay seated and you're not disrespectful if you lie down. So that caused a big conflict for me. Again,
what do we do for our organization? Here Rick Doblin talk about ayahuasca and peyote and say it's not so good. Okay, Rick. All right. That's how we got to fight for our organization. And all right, I get it. I asked you.
Works for
yeah.
many people, and you did
Yeah.
open
Okay.
it up by asking me a question.
All right. I think ayahuasca and peyote and rituals are fantastic. No, I love you, Rick. No, I get it. It's not for everybody, but I do want to say that Chacruna is trying to advocate to protect sacred plants and indigenous people and traditions and cultures. I think the medical model, yes, it's great and it works for some people. I personally don't feel so like excited about the idea of going into a hospital and having two people like watch me have my journey and guided in this context. I feel much more inclined to sit in a group ceremony and to be part of a community of practice and that does it all over again. Regardless, I think there's space for everything, right? It's not one model or another. We don't need to dominate each other. It is sad when we have just one model getting recognition and legitimacy, whereas the other doesn't. And we just did this workshop she attended about protecting churches in the United States. So we have a work that we're both trying to give visibility to indigenous voices and the idea of reciprocity, of giving back, since we already took so much and it's time to support sovereignty and the right to self-determination and the right of autonomy of indigenous people. But we're also supporting contemporary hybrid American psychedelic churches. So we just launched this guide on Religious Freedom and Restoration Act best practices. So how do you keep your medicine? How do you transport it? How do you document your doctrine? Should you declare taxes or not? Should you have insurance? Should you have create a 501c3? Do you have a board of directors? How do you keep your leadership accountable? Is there a system to deliver feedback and do leadership? Talk about that. Where does the medicine come from? Is it sustainable? Does this group engage in any practice of reciprocity? Are they giving back to any person? And you also mentioned like the young Rick and the bar mitzvah. And I think, it's an interesting other angle that traditionally a lot of these cultures where psychedelics play a central role and are part of identity. And it's not like, being countercultural or rebel or kind of doing something radical, partaking in ceremony. It's just part of being part of that culture. And it's actually part of your training and your education to participate in ceremony. It's not countercultural. It's transmission of culture. And children are an integral part of that. And children across different traditions all over the Americas and Africa, other continents, have participated in ceremony and have been taught since early life that that's part of the way you get to know reality, because we have a sort of ethnocentric and cognocentric view that these things are kind of alien to us and just a minority rebel counterculture people are interested. So there's like the one state of mind that is the true rational awake state, and all of that other states get less legitimacy, dreaming or being inebriated or under some altered states of consciousness or even disease, fever. All of those are like worse than the rational awake state. And the most sacred thing is like you have to keep children away from this, whereas other cultures, children are part of the conversation. We just a team member of us published an article called Psychedelic Parenthood, talking about these issues, but it's talking about the importance of family, but also not just one kind of family, right? Because it's not just the mom and the dad and the kid, like the happy psychedelic family. it's a family that can be diverse as well, that can be two moms or two dads or many other things. So it's about creating a conversation that includes family, but also includes other styles of family and includes like it's anti-heteronormative and the idea that there is just one way forward. anyway, I know you have your own views about parenthood. Why don't you talk about that?
Okay, I'd love to. But before that, I just want to say that I think the work that Chacruna is doing to help people with psychedelic churches is extremely important, because I think what we've come to realize is that the culture is the dominant factor, and the cultural fears about psychedelics that kind of flourished in response to the 60s blocked psychedelic research for decades. And so it was only through a certain amount of cultural change that and disillusionment with the war on drugs that led us to a place where we could be starting this research. And it's like social justice movements reinforce each other. So what actually happened during the 80s, and then I'll get to the parenthood, but just to say that what happened during the 80s was a lot of the, particularly here in San Francisco, was the AIDS crisis, and how the ACT UP and other groups that were trying to help remedy all these people that were dying from AIDS-related complications, they felt that the FDA was really moving too slowly and was overly focused on reducing risk and wasn't properly looking at try to develop drugs that could have benefits, even for deadly diseases. And so ACT UP, which was this organized group for the AIDS community, had a protest and shut down the FDA building. And that had never happened before. And that was just a real wake-up call to the FDA. And so they, in response, they created this group called the Pilot Drug Evaluation Staff, which was to expedite new ways to study drugs. And they came into effect late 89, early 1990. And it was that group looked around the FDA for different drug categories that they could practice with. And they saw that the psychedelics had been blocked for decades. And so they asked the people that had been blocking this, would they turn over all the Schedule I drugs to this new group, which they were willing to do. And it's this new group that started up psychedelic research, in part because of the activism from ACT UP. So I think what's happening now is that we've done so much in terms of the science and the key opinion leaders over the last several decades and more, that has changed culture. And we've come to appreciate a lot of the different indigenous groups that are often in a religious context as the center of their community. And so what we've got a situation right now is that when we talk about access, it's going to be through medicine. It's going to be highly controlled, only under licensed therapists. It's going to be quite expensive. Hopefully I think we're very likely to get it covered by insurance. But the religious route is another way for people to get access. Not only that, but in family settings. But the good thing that we've reached this point is because of the rise of the religious right and the Christian right and all the ways that they're trying to say that their religious freedom permits public money to go to their schools or permits them to refuse to serve different people. And the courts are filled with a fair amount of judges that look this way. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and state authorities are reluctant to go after psychedelic churches. And so there's basically very little enforcement. There's, ayahuasca that'll get seized by customs or something coming in. There's religious communities that have, pretend religious communities that have, like Soul Quest in Florida, that have lost their legal case with the DEA about religious freedom, and yet they're still operating in public, charging people money to come for ayahuasca sessions. So I think the work that Chacruna is doing to try to help people understand how to create a psychedelic church in a way that makes you more defensible if there is kind of legal action is really the growing edge in our culture for providing access. And we've got a lot of new psychedelic churches, and as long as they're careful and respectful, I don't think that this is going to change. So I think the medicine is, and the research, the scientific, is what changes culture, changes attitudes, and then permits these other forms to flourish without a lot of background. So all of that is to say that it's critical, the work that Chacruna is doing in that way. And one of the big things about these religious communities is, again, how do they educate their children? And what do they do? And they incorporate their children in these rituals. So as far as my view of psychedelics and parenthood, I knew that when I was 13, I was ready for something spiritual. I was ready for something to connect me to the wider world. And it didn't happen. And so I realized, my wife and I, when each of our 3 kids turned 13, we had a conversation with them, and we said that we think now that you're old enough, if you want marijuana or if you want MDMA, come to us and we'll give it to you, and we'll get you pure drugs, and we can do it together, and you'll see what it's like. We didn't realize that the offer to do drugs with your parents was like the best anti-drug strategy you could come up with. So we're like, here it is, and they're like, no way, don't give it to us, we're not ready. They became ready, year or two after that in different ways. So I think that the other part for me was that, because I work in this area, my wife was very concerned that I can bring my whole self to our children. She didn't want me to hide anything from them. It was good. So we got into this process. One of my absolute favorite parts of parenthood, particularly when they were little, was to smoke pot and read bedtime stories. And so for the parents that are here, you got to read the same story over and over and over and over. And by the 40th time, it's really difficult for the adults to get enthused about this storybook. But when you're high, it's so better. It's like, you just make up the narratives, and here is this like bird in the tree, and you're like, hey, what does that bird think? What's going on? And so my kids we also didn't want to tell them when they were little that this was illegal. At the time, now Massachusetts marijuana is legal. So we just normalized it. And it was only when they were old enough, like, first grade or so, that we started explaining there's certain things in our house that are different in society, and they have to be a little bit careful about that. But they just sort of accepted it. And then I just learned this from our youngest daughter. I just heard this a couple of months ago, that we say the prayer. So talk about ceremonies. So we have a little bit Friday night prayers, for Shabbat. And so one of the prayers is the prayer over the wine. Blessed art thou, Lord of the universe, who createst the fruit of the vine. So we would say the Hebrew prayer, then I would say it in English, and I would add and the bud of the plant. So we're blessing the fruit of the vine and the bud of the plant. And I just knew, of course, that I was making this up, that it's not in the prayer books, but our kids had no idea that that was the case. So our youngest child is now 25. She was recently at a friend of hers' house from college for Friday night, and they're doing the Friday night prayers, and they all say this version in English, and then she goes on, and the bud of the plant. And they're all looking at her like, what? And she's like, isn't that what the prayer says? So I think for me, psychedelics and parenthood went together great. And, and I think my kids have learned how to integrate psychedelics into their lives in the ways that are meaningful to them. It wasn't this thing that they had to hide from us. So I do think that there's so much that our culture has to learn from indigenous cultures that see this in a family context and in a community context, rather than in kind of the individualist context that I kind of grew up in. But that's because we had no community context for this. That was also wiped out. That's why it became at the acid tests or the Grateful Dead concerts or the raves. It was like our attempt in the Western culture to build these kind of communal settings that are spiritual in many ways. And people, when you ask them about the raves, one of our fundraisers is gay and lived here in San Francisco during the 80s, and said that they worked out a lot of their grief from their friends dying with ecstasy on the dance floor, and that was very spiritual and therapeutic for them both. So I think we just have to keep that in mind as well. I think when you talk about parenthood and you talk about children, and we look about how has cannabis gotten so accepted in mainstream culture, it was the medicine leads the way. So it's medicalization before legalization. But I'd say the dramatic transformation in American culture really happened around the time that CBD was being used for childhood epilepsy. And that was where Sanjay Gupta and the Weed Show on TV. So that once you start helping people's kids, and that they're struggling, their kids are struggling, and they're worried about their survival, and psychedelics or cannabis can help them, then you really have won over the whole family, and then you've won over all their generations, and then you've transformed society. So I think psychedelics and parenthood are, as well as this sort of religious aspect, part of this really critical edge towards moving towards mainstreaming psychedelics. And so I think people have said that children have developing brains and you have to prevent their developing brains from having psychedelics. It's just a slogan for the drug war. It doesn't make neuroscience sense. It doesn't make common sense. If you can layer in spirituality and love and connection and emotionality, the sooner you do it with kids, particularly when you talk about kids from abused families or something like that. The FDA, by the way, has said that if they do give us approval for MDMA assisted therapy in adults, which is 18 or over, we are required to study adolescents with PTSD. We must do that. And so that'll be starting to work with 13 to 17-year-olds. If that works, then we have to do 7 to 12-year-olds. And I do think that it'll work. And I was just, as a small thing, and we'll get back to your next question or so, but we were just the last couple of days, we had the MAPS board of directors meetings. And there's a woman, Gul Doland, who's now come to work here at Berkeley. And she's done this incredible study giving MDMA to octopuses. And so what she, if you've seen My Octopus Teacher, octopuses are extremely solitary creatures until the end of their life when they mate and then they have their babies, and then they die. So they're so antagonistic to other octopuses that they will often fight to the death to clear territory with other octopuses. So Gul at Johns Hopkins wondered what happens if you give MDMA to an octopus. She heard all this pro-social stuff about MDMA, and it's also the case around 600 million years ago, humans and octopuses, started our different routes, but octopuses still process serotonin. And so what happens when you give them MDMA? So it turns out it took her a while to figure out the right dose for an octopus. But once she figured it out, the octopuses hang out with other octopuses instead of run away from them. And so this pro-social part of MDMA is pre-verbal and evolutionary conserved. And so I think when you start talking about children who've been traumatized, a lot of them, we heard yesterday a story about someone who is selectively mute, that a lot of times you end up overwhelming kids so much that they don't even know how to phrase things. They can't really talk about it. So I think this sense that the MDMA, and I think it'll generalize, of course, to other psychedelics, that it has both a physiological effect in an independent of the psychotherapeutic effect, that I think we can reliably say that these psychedelics can be very helpful for children who've been traumatized. Also, ketamine, for those of you that work with ketamine, in operations, anesthesiologists give roughly 10 times the therapeutic dose for operations. And then you're completely knocked out. You don't remember. You can be cut up and, it doesn't hurt. And, you're not really there. But when the drug, the anesthesia wears off, you go through this process where the drug is getting down and down to where you pass through the psychedelic phase. And they call it the emergent phenomena as you're emerging from this operation. And they don't prepare people for it at all. And it turns out, though, that adults have a lot more difficult time with this emergent phenomena than kids do. And that they use ketamine now in operations with kids all the time because they're not that far away from what's real, what's my imagination. So I think it's just another bit of evidence to suggest that this idea of psychedelics in childhood, particularly in family or spiritual context, really makes a lot of sense.
Disclaimer, the Chacruna Institute is not recommending that you go give psychedelic drugs to your children.
You don't?
I mean,
what do you mean?
I mean,
what do you mean? In
the context, no, I'm not, definitely, but I just feel that as an executive director of the organization, I don't want, it's a little joke, but yeah, it's important to be mindful. It's just like, it's not something that you just do randomly. You have to have your education. I think, I really appreciate the medicalization. I think Chacruna is trying to tell a little bit of a different story. So it's like this idea that you had the counterculture, and the counterculture was kind of a disaster, and then it created this big backlash. But then, we got the chance to then have the scientific research, and then the scientific research proved that it has value, and now we're getting legitimacy again, and now it's the time for the religion and other things. We're trying to like rewrite a bit this narrative, but I think there's space for all narratives. I personally think the counterculture was fantastic, and I'm here saying I'm queer because there is a counterculture that allows me to feel safe to say that, and psychedelics did help create a revolution and change our habits and our views and our minds and our patterns and the idea of what is permissible or what is normal, what is allowable. And so these things already existed before the science. They were already done by people in positions that are not of power and privilege, that marginalized people have always been doing this. Women and people of color, Black people have always created rituals. And, there's a whole other story that has not been told and that has not been seen, despite this like train of the scientific research and the advancement. And it is this story that we're trying to elevate. And it is those voices, when the medical doctors went there and created their research, the woman was holding their hands, because you know what? Those big men, they were afraid to take those substances. And the woman was like, okay, I can help you, and the women were also caretakers in the background. They help prepare the patients, they help select, they help put the buckets, they help the husbands write down the research that was being done. They help figure out the data. They help the guy write the manuscript discussing with her. So when the paper comes out, there is the paper and the research, but then what is the history of that woman? And what is the history of that caretaking? What is the history of that wisdom that doesn't appear on the scientific paper, that is not part of the mainstream narrative of the psychedelic field? These are the stories that Chacruna is helping to tell. What are, people of color, women, they frequently have been servants of people that are in positions of power and privilege, and they can let go and feel free to trip. Not everybody has the same safety to trip, because you know what? If you are an immigrant, or if you're a person of color and you're tripping and the police finds you, it's going to be less likely that you're going to say, I'm doing something that is very important for my soul, and I'm doing some self-exploration that is fundamental for me to understanding, my spirituality, or my inner healer, or my ability to heal. So I think these other uses, they have already been around. These other uses, they were already important. These other voices, they were already there. And so again, I respect, obviously the path of medicalization. I am an anthropologist. I don't like the idea that science has more, power or knowledge. And if it does, it's wrong. And we have to change that. And let's change that power, because science is not the only truth, and it's not the universal measure of reality. And it works for a few people, but it's very limited, way of understanding. I'm going to quote somebody that I respect a lot. His name is Rick Doblin. Rick and I were in a debate with some really anti-drug people, like super evil anti-drug czars. And I got nervous, but I kept my cool during the debate. And
to some extent,
yes, I think so, but not as good pro as him. But they were also just letting him speak and not listening to me. Have you ever heard, when you're a woman and kind of like they go to the guy and ask them, and then you're like trying to get your voice there. So after in the thing, the whole guy was like super negative, and he's like, well, there's not enough scientific evidence that MDMA heals, and the research is poor, and the methods are bad, and well, what is MAPS, and this training, it doesn't make any sense. He was very negative, and he kept on saying, but I tried MDMA, I did try it, and it helped me, and I understand that. So when we were in the post debate, the guy was like continuing, and then I lost my cool because I was like irritated, and I started to argue with him. And Rick said, hey, uh, you Jeff, his name, okay. Hey, did do you have a scientific paper to quote about your experience on MDMA? He said, "Did you like the experience?" He said, "No, I really liked it." And Rick said, "Do you have a paper to show to me that says that your experience was important?" And that was really, it killed it, because he had a personal good experience, but he didn't have a scientific paper to show, to claim that his experience was good. And so why am I telling this tale? Because there's a lot of things that are not on the scientific papers, and that's what Chacruna is like talking about. But we're not just trying to isolate the scientific research. We're trying to create bridges, right? And everybody talks about that, but people are not really doing that. So is there a dialogue between shamanism and neuroscience? And think about the millions of dollars, the billions of dollars that we're spending on this whole track of commercialization of MDMA. How many millions are being put into creating dialogues with like indigenous leaders and shamans to think about things that are crucial for healing as a holistic modality that has to do not just with what property of a substance for a specific disease or ailment, but as a set of relationships, healing as a relationship you have to yourself. So the property of that substance, a relationship you have to yourself, but the relationship you have to your kin, to your community, and to this larger, set of relationships that are, maybe the invisible world or the planet or whatever you want to call it. So all of these dimensions of healing that are so important that get sometimes lost in this model of clinical trials and medicalization. And I don't think it's just about creating the science and now it's time for this other thing. It's always been the time for this other thing since before. And that's a little bit what Chacruna is about. But we are also supporting the expansion of the field as a whole. And we like to be collaborative. We're all about creating partnerships. So Chacruna has over 70 community partners, and we have also a membership system. And we want to create things that are collective. But again, shedding light on this, because the problem is like, who is funding this ecosystem as a whole? There's a lot of money going into that direction, but who is funding initiatives that are talking about this? All about this, about culture, about indigenous people, about Black people, about the dangers of the commercialization and commodification, the vulgarization, the banalization, the fact that a lot of people in charge have never even taken a psychedelic, and that's just obscene. People that are making major decisions for the future of our field that hold zero personal experience and that have never, been in a situation of getting beaten up by a sacred plant and feeling your level of humbleness, and that you just need to, there's something bigger than us, and something that I'm really hoping that this field can move in ways that respect reciprocity, that respects minorities, that respects indigenous people and plant medicine. And it's not all about money and commercialization. It's about ethics. It's about integrity. It's about a holistic understanding of healing. It's about being community. And as Rick said, it's about not being afraid of the heavy conversations. Let's talk about sexual abuse. Let's talk about conservation. Let's talk about queer issues. Let's talk about racial justice. Let's talk about reciprocity. Let's talk about giving back. And so Chacruna is proud to not run away. It's a highly, highly polarized United States. It's very heavy post-pandemic, post-George Floyd, a lot of tension in this country. And we're not escaping from those conversations. And we're also just brave to advocate for the importance of culture. So I want to invite everybody for our next conference. We just held psychedelic science. Chacruna had a big tent there. And now Chacruna is launching our conference, Psychedelic Culture. So there's psychedelic science and there's psychedelic culture. We're all part of this ecosystem. Rick, I really have you in the highest regards, and with all that you do for the field, and thank you so much. And yeah, I want to thank everybody again, especially come up here, Clancy. She's very shy, and my love, and she's like a force behind Chacruna. So talking a lot about things on the background, and not always. Just people need to know that Clancy is really behind everything, and she's. We're together for 13 years. What do you want to say?
Support Chacruna.
Right. Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, let me just add one thing, which is that I do think that the voices that Chacruna brings to this cultural debate and the topics are absolutely essential, because there are a lot of these hard conversations that get missed in a lot of contexts, and Bia just has some unerring sense, even though it's a whole different culture, about what the next things are that are not being talked about that need to be talked about more. So I've really appreciated your intuition about what is really the next big things to elevate. But just I will say that our approach on science is not really, I'd like to say that we don't really do science, we do political science, meaning that the science that we do is chosen, the drugs that we use, the patient populations, all of that has a political overlay to how do we reach out to the culture that we're in right now, and how do we make those changes. So just as an example, roughly 2/3 of the people that are in our studies are women. There's 13 million PTSD patients in America. Most of them are women who've suffered sexual abuse or domestic violence, things like that. But the attention in the media goes to the veterans and the first responders. That's what's enabled us to build bipartisan support, so that of all the issues that are being discussed right now, there's almost none of them that have not been caught up in the culture wars. And so, I mean, it's hard to say how good this is or anything, but Matt Gaetz is, one of our big supporters for psychedelics. Matt Gaetz and AOC co-authored a bill on psychedelics. So we're bringing people together so while we do science, I want to say that it's about the political utility of science, both to move through the regulatory systems, create ideally contexts where insurance will cover, but also to change the larger cultural narrative, so that then the psychedelic churches can move without oppression from the police authorities, and where we can have all these other discussions that Chacruna and Bia do such a great job of bringing to the fore. So that's another aspect. It's not just that we elevate Western forms of knowledge and science above all else. It's just they have more political utility in the cultural change movement that we're trying to do now.
And more, we always like to confront each other. So to be continued. Thank you, everybody, in the next event.